All right, so we are going to go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone, both in person and on today's live stream. My name is Sydney Yeager, and I am the public programs producer here at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. So thank you so much for joining us for today's event. Before we get started, for anyone who is here in person, if you could turn off your cell phones or silence them and anything else that makes noise for the duration of the program. Also, you'll notice that if you are here in person that there are note cards and pencils around. If you have any questions during the program, please write them down on the note cards, and we will come around and collect them near the end of the hour to be asked. And for those of you who are joining us on the live stream, feel free to put your questions in the chat, and we will also ask those at the end of the hour. Thank you so much again for joining us today, and I know you don't want to hear from me as much, so I am going to pass the torch over to Dagmar Herzog, our speaker for today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you for coming, and thank you to everyone who's watching online also. Let's see if this works. When you think about the Holocaust, 6 million Jews murdered, you undoubtedly think of concentration camps and ghettos, of death factories like Auschwitz, where 1 million Jews were murdered in gas chambers fed by Zyklon B, a pesticide, or of other death camps. Or you think of, quote, the Holocaust by bullets, because 2 million Jews in Poland, and especially in the Nazi-occupied territories of the Soviet Union, were murdered in mass shootings. Less familiar, although impressively well integrated into the exhibit downstairs, are the nearly 300,000 Nazi, quote, euthanasia murders, and I do put quotation marks because it's a euphemism. The euthanasia murders of people carrying diagnoses of psychiatric illness or behavioral or intellectual deficits. In one of 6 carbon monoxide-fueled gas chambers, in mass shootings on the Eastern Front, or by medication overdose, poisoning, or systematic starvation. Hitler would call a halt to the initial gas chamber phase of euthanasia in the wake of Catholic Bishop von Galen's internationally resonant sermon of August 1941, eloquently decrying the killings. But soon, 121 men who had gotten their training and practice in murdering people with disabilities were transferred to Nazi-occupied Poland to assemble the death factories of Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka. There, with great energy and ingenuity, these men would accomplish a full quarter of the Holocaust, 1.5 million human beings, with carbon monoxide. It was not least by reference to this key detail of sequential connection and overlap in personnel between the murders of individuals with disabilities and the murders of European Jewry that engaged researchers eventually succeeded in cohering a scholarly consensus that the euthanasia murders deserved recognition as Nazism's first genocide. The late historian and Auschwitz survivor Henry Friedlander at several occasions told the story of being accosted recurrently as he was researching the entanglements between euthanasia and the Holocaust, and informed that his was a completely mistaken approach. How can you compare Jews with crazy people? One top-level official within an American Jewish organization had indignantly demanded, and Henry told the story over and over. But also many others within Holocaust studies circles were unconvinced why they should care about what happened to, quote, the handicapped. This was so even though the very first installment of the mega crime that we now call the Holocaust was a special action targeting specifically those individuals who were both Jewish and disabled. Jews with cerebral palsy, epilepsy, autism, Down syndrome, or mental illness. Nor is it irrelevant that the US in the 1930s had explicitly denied visas to individuals with intellectual or physical impairments. And thus also Jewish families fleeing the Third Reich were forced to leave disabled family members behind. Friedlander's own answer to the question that had been posed to him came in the form of his groundbreaking book, The Origins of the Nazi Genocide, 1995. In the preface, Friedlander explained how he had come over the course of the 1980s and early 90s to understand the murder of the disabled not merely as a, quote, prologue to the Holocaust, but indeed as its first chapter. For Friedlander, moreover, the killing of people with disabilities would come to serve as the model for all Nazi killing operations. Friedlander's framing of the issues has been broadly persuasive. The U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, in its own efforts to integrate the history of euthanasia more adequately into its presentation of the Holocaust, on a recently developed webpage, referred to the killing of people with disabilities as, quote, in itself a rehearsal for Nazi Germany's broader genocidal policies. Within Germany, however, in the years around the end of the Cold War, highlighting the interrelationships between euthanasia and the Holocaust, no matter how asymmetrical their sizes, and even as the connections were initially made more by intuitive analogy, you can see the wheelchair inside the yellow star, than by specifying literal links, had served a further crucial function. This was the indispensable assistance such references provided for advancing the so long rebuffed cause of disability rights. For as it happens, the more immediate post-World War II decades had seen a, in hindsight, stunning, then simply crushing, breadth of popular support for the perpetrators and ongoing shaming of victims and their families. It took into the 1980s and 90s to get not just the euthanasia murders taken seriously as a mass crime, but also the approximately 400,000 coercive sterilizations, the majority enacted on individuals designated as feeble-minded, to be formally acknowledged as an injustice at all, and tens of thousands of often deeply traumatized survivors offered even the most insultingly meager amount of recognition and recompense. And except for pockets of amazingness, which I then made it my business to recover and highlight in both West and East Germany, it took even longer to change popular attitudes and actual practices of education and care on an everyday basis. Unlearning eugenics proved to be a very long post-fascist process. The disabled were not, quote, the forgotten victims, but rather aggressively repudiated ones. Inducing identification, or even just empathy, with the plight of people with disabilities, especially those with cognitive impairments or psychiatric diagnoses, although there was in the post-war a dismaying amount of ugly hostility toward people with physical disabilities as well, turned out to be enormously challenging. Activist effort in presenting the murders of people with disabilities as, quote, the trial run for the Judeocide, in the words of journalist Ernst Clay, who's one of my book's heroes, was by no means just a summary finding based on a wealth of empirical evidence. It was above all an ethically engaged, passionately pursued strategy for undehumanizing the disabled, for insisting that their suffering should matter. So when I first began the research for the book, I was in the archives at the Hadamar Memorial Center near Frankfurt. So Hadamar was one of the 6 T4 gas chamber killing sites on German soil, and these are dream catchers made by school children to memorialize the victims. Inside the barn, this is the barn, where buses brought patients to be killed. And there's the gas chamber also. And I had a lot of questions. The scholarship on the 3 professions that saw the topic of intellectual disability as part of their remits, I always say reli med ped, so religious charity, psychiatric medicine, and remedial pedagogy, is large, but the fields and their interactions are rarely analyzed in a unified way, and not much attention has been paid to how contemporaries at each historical juncture argued over the value of disabled lives. For example, why, in the post-fascist era, had it been so agonizingly difficult to find compelling language and enact concrete policies and practices to defend or even cherish the positive value of disabled lives? Were there really no pre-fascist traditions that could serve as orienting resources? How far back in history or how far forward did one have to go to find people who did not hierarchize human worth? When prominent professionals called openly for the murder of, quote, the total idiots in the population, what kinds of counter-arguments had religious leaders or remedial educators tried to put forward? And when German eugenicists, even as they conceded they couldn't be sure of the source of cognitive impairments and that their surmises about, quote, recessive genetic transmission were simply guesses or projections, debated frenetically in the 1910s, 20s, and 30s, whether it was 1% or 10% or even 20 or 30% of their fellow citizens who were so subpar that they should be prevented from procreating, who, if anyone in their time, was audacious enough to point out that their math and their science alike were faulty. Was it really impossible at that moment to see not just how cruel, but also how absurd was the eugenic fantasy that it could even be feasible to extirpate by sterilization or murder imperfection in the body politic? And how eventually would those fantasies be robbed of their power if they ever fully have been? So those were my questions. And a first difficult point that became clear is that although there was a tiny overlap, maybe 10%, max 15, between those individuals targeted for sterilization and those chosen for murder, the sterilizations and the murders were largely targeted at different subgroups. This may seem un-PC and insensitive to mention, but nothing that happened makes sense without it. The Nazis, and everyone else too, made distinctions between the significantly disabled, those to be killed, and the mildly or moderately impaired, designated for sterilization. Factors that strongly increased the likelihood of being chosen for death included incontinence, epilepsy, high care needs, and, quote, incapacity for work, or in the case of children, identification as ineducable. And while among those selected for coercive sterilization, there were indeed individuals whose sensory impairments, like blindness or deafness, had been accurately identified as heritable. The second largest category among the sterilized after feeble-mindedness, that's the first category, which is not biologically heritable, was schizophrenia, which was another one of those totally elastic, totally subjectively ascribed diagnoses. Secondly, recognizing the special challenges confronting those striving to make a case for the rights to life, to engaged attention, to love, to joy, education, of those so significantly impaired that they would have been targeted for death in the Third Reich, I kept searching to recover whatever traces I could find of advocacy on behalf of people with the most significant intellectual disabilities, whether that advocacy was religiously or secularly inspired. And I found them. They were always anomalies, singular individuals, but they show what was imaginable, and they can be resources for us in the future as well. A third point, however, is that overall it would take a full 100 years. From the 1870s, when many Christian and several impressive Jewish residential institutions first emerged across the German landscape, to the 1970s, when a new generation of professionals and activists revolted against what they perceived as an abhorrent preliminary post-fascist settlement, before a comprehensive, anti-hierarchical, egalitarian, integrationist vision would be articulated and at least an experimental oases in both East and West put into lived practice. So one measure of the enormity of the transformation that's been achieved just over the last 20 years, really since the turn of the millennium, can be found in the self-evidence with which now both secular and religious advocacy and support organizations working with and for persons with impairments have come to take as their bedrock premises the twinned ideals of individual self-determination and full social integration. The premier secular lobby association, Aktion Mensch, with clever ads on billboards and in social media, markets the beauties for everyone of a barrier-free society in which bodily and mentally differences are celebrated and encounters with, learning from, and social engagement on behalf of differently abled others are great sources of pleasure and meaning. But it's an incredibly recent change, and the path to get to this point was arduously long. So I want to take the remainder of my time to give you an overview of the arc of developments, and there's two parts, and part one is called Institutionalization and its Discontents. So, starting from the 1870s onwards, hundreds of residential institutions were founded to take in people with intellectual disabilities. Why? Takeaway point number one. Cognitive disability had everything to do with poverty and untreatable diseases. Malnutrition, lack of vitamins and protein, overwork of the mother during pregnancy, and environmental toxins, but above all, childhood brain fevers and infections before there were antibiotics, and epilepsy before there were effective meds to control seizures. Of course, The middle and upper classes occasionally gave birth to children with intellectual disabilities as well. Loss of oxygen in a difficult birth process, or again, those untreatable childhood fevers, encephalitis and meningitis. But everyone agreed that 85, if not 90%, came from the ranks of the very poor. That was true of those with psychiatric illness as well. And because of demographic growth happening in the midst of rapid industrialization, with people leaving rural areas and moving to the cities, some of which were literally quadrupling in size, there simply were more people in need, living in more squalor. Putting the vulnerable into institutions was, without question, a tactic of poverty management, and one that German governments were willing, albeit at minimalist rates, to help finance. These institutions kept growing in number and size. You can see they turned into entire villages, entire counterworlds to modernity. Takeaway number 2 is caregiver ambivalence. The directors and the staff were all too easily irritated by what turned out to be the incurability of, quote, idiocy, and they hierarchized. They made a tripartite pecking order of human worth. There was the educable, the merely trainable, and those they labeled care cases. People unable to contribute any sort of, quote, useful labor, and who instead, above all, required the labor of care from others. As the institutions grew, this bottom third of care cases was neglected. They were fed and diapered, but otherwise ignored. Nobody engaged them therapeutically. The pictures here are from one special place, Bethel, like House of God, near Bielefeld. But it turns out to be the exception that proves the rule, the one remarkable site where the leadership was committed to defending the preciousness of the lives also of those unable to work, showing that they could be cherished. And there might be like 4 or 5 other places that took their inspiration from here, but this was, to my great dismay, really more the exception than the rule. It was not the norm. Relatedly, beside the institutions, there was another phenomenon growing, as many German towns established remedial schools for kids who were having trouble in regular classrooms. An unpleasant feature of the discussions between the residential institution directors and the remedial school teachers is that they competed with each other over who would get, quote, the better material, the more enlivening elements. In other words, the children who were more gratifying to teach. As a result, the institutions were left with ever more care cases, along with a few of the trainable folks, but not so many of the educable ones. And meanwhile, psychiatric asylums for people with mental illness, as opposed to disability, were overflowing too. And then takeaway number 3, expressing death wishes against people with more severe disabilities was becoming socially acceptable by the 1890s at the latest. 2 groups were targeted: deformed or mentally disabled newborns and people who had been long-term institutionalized and were considered to be those hopeless care cases. Arguments presented included humanitarian pity and utilitarian arguments about the cost of care. But the most compelling to the most people involved the alluring fantasy of Germans becoming a folk that was healthy, strong, beautiful, and smart. And this ideal was presented with an erotic charge. The more ugliness and weakness you kill, the more robust and fabulous the German people would be. So these sentiments, death wishes, were in the air, and a few Christians and special educators were starting to worry that they didn't know how to make persuasive counterclaims. They, too, were confused as to why God would allow such disability to happen. I would really say disability turned out to be the Achilles heel of Christian faith right around 1900. And you can see here, Otto Ernst, who was a very famous, popular dramatist and poet, is saying Jehovah regrets that he created these, basically saying God would like it if we would simply kill them on his behalf. And amidst all this, at the latest by the early 1910s, doctors and teachers were starting to reverse causation. Although everyone knew, all along that poverty created the conditions that produced much disability, experts began to blame the poor for their, quote, inferior, substandard hereditary material. They started to biologize it. Poor people were biologically defective, and they passed those defects on to their children. That was the new message. It sounded scientific and was presented with authority, but it was actually a bluff. I'm especially intrigued by experts who acknowledged honestly, in private or public, that medical science really did not know the cause of most cases of idiocy or of milder feeble-mindedness, but those admissions were rare. Instead, prominent respected figures like the psychiatrist Emil Kraepelin, along with many reductive popularizers, developed a kind of Lamarckian style of reasoning which took environmental damages, also poverty, into account, but still managed to insist that the acquired deficiencies would be transmitted hereditarily, and B, searched through entire family trees, treating instances of any irregularity, mental illness, addiction, physical impairments, moral weakness, as interchangeable signs of defect that lent empirical weight to the presumption that a cognitive impairment had been hereditary rather than environmental or random. Yes, eugenics was an international movement, popular also in the US, where similarly sketchy arguments were made, also often directed against perceived defects among the poor. And also in Europe, its range reached from Scandinavia and England to Italy, Hungary, and Romania. But Germany was precocious, both in the extent of institutionalization and developments of remedial education, and Germany was precocious in fantasies about being at the very pinnacle of human perfection. And then, boom, World War I. Takeaway number 4, Germany lost World War I, and the military defeat was experienced by many as a, quote, national humiliation. It's precisely in the aftermath of the lost war in 1920 that lawyer Carl Binding and psychiatrist Alfred Hoche published Permission to Annihilate Life Unworthy of Life. What was new about the book was not that they bluntly demanded killing the people they referred to as total idiots. Those conversations have been going on for 20 years. Nor that they marshaled emotional and economic arguments elaborating on a feeling of disgust and expense. The real novelty was that they provided a plan for how victims should be chosen. They proposed a committee of 2 doctors and 1 lawyer to examine cases of significant disability and decide on who was incurable and therefore kill-worthy. And in the end, for the Nazis, there would be 3 doctors, no lawyer, who made the decisions based on patient health records. But there's no question that it's this little book that served as the template for Nazi euthanasia killings. Okay, point number 5, Christians freaked out. The people targeted for murder were the residents in their institutions. They had dedicated themselves to providing care, but as I indicated, they were long since ambivalent themselves about that care, and moreover were feeling defensive because they were accused by eugenicists that merely by keeping the disabled alive, thus allowing people with disabilities to reproduce, Christians were themselves responsible for the purportedly looming death of the German folk. And the Christians stumbled badly in trying to react and had trouble explaining why not kill. Now, Catholics, because of their opposition to intervention in reproduction, said less and did better, dismissing Binding and Hoche as outrageous and not worthy of response, or as this one remarkable Catholic theologian from the University of Munich, Franz Walter, did, poked scathing fun at the economic logic and the way Binding and Hoche pretended that if several thousand disabled people were killed, suddenly there'd be so much more money to go around for everyone else. The Protestants, by contrast, were a mess. A few prominent theologians and religious educators actually stated that there were human beings so very disabled that it might be morally acceptable to kill them. Protestants actively involved in charity, by contrast, strove to remind readers that thou shalt not kill was one of the 10 commandments. Nevertheless, these charity men did also seem to feel the need to double down on portraying people with disabilities as repellent, and they took the occasion to float a new theory that sexual sin was the cause of so much disability, actually blaming Jews in the media for encouraging sexual liberality. And they came up with a compromise formation, formally announced by the leaders of the Protestant Intermission in 1931. Remember, we're still in Weimar, still a democracy, in which they declared murder no, but sterilization yes. And also remember, the call to kill was directed at the severely disabled. Talk about sterilization involved the not so disabled. But for overdetermined reasons, eagerness to modernize, a perceived opportunity to lend scientific heft to their sexual conservatism, maybe also a chance to be disinhibited, Protestants jumbled together conversations about euthanasia and eugenics. Notice, in the official resolution of 1931, they insult the disabled as being the products of, quote, guilt and sin. And their argument for why people with disabilities should not be killed is that the disgust that the disabled evoke provides an important lesson in chastity for the healthy. It's not a strong argument for why not kill. It's a kind of theo-biopolitics, a self-serving mashup of eugenics and religion. 2 years later, 1933, the Nazis are in power. And Catholics, as well as Protestants, enthusiastically praise Adolf Hitler and the new regime. They rush to blame Jews for all that they disliked about Weimar democracy. Catholic bishops do criticize the sterilization law, which was promulgated in July of 33, but ultimately are powerless to prevent the majority of sterilizations. Protestants, by contrast, eagerly sterilize, offering up their residence and volunteering their hospitals for the surgeries and justifying them with further religious arguments. So this is interesting. These are important, famous institutions for the disabled, and you'll see here the little swastikas out on the picnic, right, and here you can see the swastika that is basically being woven into a basket in one of the workshops. Ordinary people in anguish resisted the verdicts of the sterilization courts and defended their rights to bodily integrity. One man, Wilhelm Werner, in that small percentage of people who were coercively sterilized and later murdered, this is the only drawings we have from someone who was a sterilization victim who was murdered, represented the sterilization as a castration, a profound and devastating violation. In 1939, in conjunction with Hitler's launch of World War II, euthanasia begins, initially by poison and bullets, and then, here we go, from January 1940 on, in the 6 carbon monoxide gas chambers disguised as showers. That's called the T4 phase, after Tiergartenstrasse 4 in Berlin, where the murders were organized. After von Galen's sermon in August of 41, so a year and a half later, right, the killings have been going on for that long, it's clearly an open secret. Children are taunting each other that they're going to be sent into the baking oven, and anyone in the vicinity of the sites sees and smells the distinctive brown smoke. Hitler, aware that he needs the support of the churches and the citizenry for the war against the Soviet Union he's just launched 2 months earlier, shuts down the gas chambers on German soil, and in early 1942, as I mentioned, sends the perpetrators to Poland to turn their attention to the Holocaust. So here you see Belzec, Treblinka, and Sobibor. But in fact, the euthanasia murders do not stop. They just change methods. So 70,000 human beings were killed in the gas chambers, but double that, another 140,000 German fellow citizens are murdered in the second so-called wild decentralized phase by starvation, medication, and poison, methods which are not visible to the public in the way the smoke used to be, and which can easily be veiled because once war arrives with bombing also on the German home front, there are lots of excuses to, quote, relocate, in other words, deport, relocate residents from one institution or hospital to another and then another. Oh, we have to get them out of the way of the bombs. And then, of course, although initially there had been protest letters written and efforts to save residents by sending them home to their families or changing the diagnoses, both Catholic and Protestant institutions in this second phase, although again there are protest letters, all too often in practice gave up their residents for, quote, relocation when ordered to do so, even when they knew that the destination was death. No less depressing is that a number of Christian institutions gave up their Jewish patients even earlier when the Nazis demanded it, in some cases in order to maintain their tax-exempt status. So, second part, memory and care. What was it like to survive this nightmare? Or imagine bearing a disabled child, perhaps a newborn with cerebral palsy, into a post-euthanasia nation. This is Grafenek. This is what I didn't mention to you. Let me just talk about, yeah, maybe I should just say something about this. This is just so you can picture one of the key of the 6 T4 sites. It's the first actively functioning gassing institution. It's a lovely, imposing castle near Stuttgart called Grafeneck. More than 10,000 people were murdered there in a shower room inside a garage on the premises. This is it. Generally, immediately upon arrival. The staff had a wonderful time, horseback riding, swimming, skiing, the men partying at the local pub with their female assistants who typed the fake condolence letters, bragging drunkenly about the, quote, good fertilizer that the smoke from the cremated corpses was spreading over nearby fields. Relatedly, at Hartheim in Austria, the perpetrators partied, and Hartheim is also where exhausted concentration camp prisoners, no longer, quote, useful, were sent to be killed. And after they stopped killing the disabled there, the first group, they again was murdered, was 70 Jews from Mauthausen. A final awful fact is that ability to work was what kept moderately disabled people alive. And in the second phase, when mass murder was at its height, there were sites at which the entire system of both care and killing depended on the labor of the disabled. So, for example, Hadamar, where I began my research near Frankfurt, throughout the second phase, ran almost entirely on patient labor, all cooking, laundry, shoe repair, grounds crews, everything. It was the patients who dug the holes for the mass graves on the hill above the asylum, and they had to hold down resistant fellow patients by force for lethal injections. There are unmistakable echoes here with the death factories of the Holocaust. Okay, now, into the post-war. What was it like to survive that nightmare? So, imagine burying a disabled child into a post-euthanasia nation. For people carrying diagnoses of intellectual impairment, the situation in democratic West Germany after 1945 was pretty desolate. There was no cultural consensus that the sterilizations or even the murders were morally wrong. The disabled did not count as full human beings. The systematic slaughter had stopped, but the self-excusing cover-ups and strategic rewriting of the recent past were just beginning. For those who were living in residential charity or psychiatric institutions and had, whether by luck or capacity to provide some form of labor, managed to elude the Nazi murder machinery, circumstances remained grim. Ex-Nazis were hired back as wardens. Attitudes everywhere had become brutalized. Legally, if the foundational self-defense claim we're also familiar with regard to the murder of the Jews was, quote, I was just following orders, the baseline contention with regard to euthanasia was, oh, I thought it was legal. Or there was simply the argument that Binding and Hoche had been correct all along, that the killing was righteous. The judges in a case in Hamburg in 1949 declared that they themselves were, quote, not of the opinion that the annihilation of the mentally completely dead and empty human shells, as Hoche called them, was absolutely and a priori immoral. Public opinion, too, was largely on the side of the perpetrators. Accused doctors could count on strong support. There were petition campaigns on their behalf with hundreds of signatures, while victims and their families remained covered in shame. In the wider public, not just indifference, but active hostility toward the disabled, including strikingly anti-Semitic violence, this mixture of anti-Jewish and anti-disabled sentiment, in one scandalous case in Bavaria, at the prospect of living in proximity to children with disabilities remained. Opinion surveys conducted in the later 60s found close to 70% of those questioned taking the view that it would, quote, be good if a child with intellectual disability died young. So, what would be needed to rupture this largely unchallenged accord? It took until the 70s, and in many cases, the 80s and 90s. It was a three-way combination of, first, loving parents demanding integration of their children into regular schools, and also a newly self-confident activist movement of people who were physically disabled, like from polio or muscular dystrophy or a car accident. They called themselves the Cripple Movement, and they identified with people with mental disabilities and fought on their behalf in solidarity, together with young radicals in all the helping professions that worked with the disabled. So psychologists, doctors, nurses, teachers, physical therapists, and social workers, and scholars and journalists. Together, this younger generation initiated a revolution in thinking about disability. They got the sterilizations and the murders recognized as crimes. Interestingly, because of the specific phrasing of German reparations law, they had to show that trying to improve the folk by sterilizations counted as a form of racism. And by telling the really graphic story of the horrors, the journalist, Ernst Clay, got the wider public finally to be able to identify emotionally with the victims and their families, and at long last to be disgusted by the perpetrators. But above all, activists changed how care and education were practiced. So they changed how people with disabilities were treated in everyday life, and that meant campaigning for deinstitutionalization, dismantling the old mega institutions and getting people into family-sized group homes, and it meant completely revamping special ed. So here are my heroes. The most impressive radicals were two dissident special education teachers who modeled in practice and as professors taught their thousands and thousands of university students that yes, you can refuse all hierarchization of human worth. No more pecking order. You can see also severely disabled persons as fully equal and be in reciprocal mutual relationship and honor their preferences. And yes, you can teach in such a creative way that all are able to participate in community. These individuals rescued people that had been neglected for decades, and they showed that it was totally possible. So, what can we make of this 150-year story that runs from the 1870s to our 2020s present? For a long time into the post-war, people did not realize that the second decentralized phase of the euthanasia murders had such a large number of victims. They somehow assumed that Bishop von Galen's sermon had actually stopped the murders. So when the first post-war commentators tried to theorize the relationships between killing the disabled and the Holocaust, they focused on contrast. Heartbroken that neither of the Christian churches had officially protested the persecution and slaughter of Jews, they saw Bishop von Galen's sermon as a sign that Christians at least protested killing of the disabled and that the protests made a difference. But by the 80s, it had become clearer to activists that they could get the public to take Nazi euthanasia more seriously if they could connect it to the Holocaust. So they emphasized the sequence I told you about, the point that euthanasia, as it became standard to argue, had been the trial run for the Holocaust, the test, the model, the rehearsal. That was an effective strategy for advancing respect for disability rights, which had been for so long resisted. But of course, one shouldn't need to hook a small genocide to a large genocide to make people care. People with disabilities should count as fully human all on their own. So there's a third way, which I find the most interesting after all this research, which is to think about these asymmetrically sized crimes as related by complementarity. So rather than contrast or connection, it's complementarity. And by that I mean understanding the Nazis as motivated by both racial hatred against Jews and racial fear against the imperfections within themselves. As one wonderful historian, one of my heroines, Gisela Bach, put it, the promised race, the master folk, was not a given. It was not the real existing German folk. Rather, the master race had yet to be produced. The Nazis were arrogant, and they were anxious. They had a fantasy of making the German folk healthy, strong, beautiful, and smart. But it was just a fantasy, not a fact, and that's why they sterilized and killed the supposedly imperfect Germans. And then there's one last wrinkle. The far-right party, AfD, Alternative für Deutschland, entered the Bundestag in 2017 and is doing scarily well. Its politics are a kind of postmodern fascism. It's primarily racist against migrants, but a big part of its success involves its family values posturing, even as it also luxuriates in deliberate sexiness. There are huge echoes here with Nazism's very similar mix of racism and eroticism. But another distinctive feature is its anti-disability messaging. No other far-right party in the world is obsessed with disability quite the way the AfD is. Borrowing from the anti-disability playbook, time-honored strategies of stirring emotions, above all disgust, and economic worries. This was especially evident in a formal, quote, inquiry to the government in 2018 with regard to the utterly fabricated issue of migrant families supposedly producing disproportionately more children with cognitive impairments because of the, again, fantasized prevalence of, quote, incestuous marriage between blood relatives among refugees. It took me a while to understand that this anti-Muslim claim was actually grafted onto an older anti-Semitic trope from the 1920s, in which it was contended that Jews produced more cognitively disabled offspring than Gentiles due to their prevalence of marriages between blood relatives. But the AFD's biggest animus is directed against the inclusion of children with disabilities in mainstream schools. What deep-seated insecurities about the citizenry's intelligence might cause the very notion of children with and without disabilities spending time together to turn into apparently the single most objectionable aspect of the only so recently won rights for people with disabilities in Germany? To me, it demonstrates once again that the would-be dominant group is never naturally dominant. One of the many ways we can recognize a fascism when we see one is how much it loves trampling on weakness and coming up with rationalizations for cruelty. But also, racial arrogance is often inextricable from a low sense of self-worth. Thank you.